Hello, and thank you for joining the webinar. We'll begin in a few minutes as we are just waiting for people to join. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this webinar on the GSMA Inclusive Tech Lab. My name is Munir Bello, and I'm a member of the mobile money team at GSMA, within which the lab sits. I'll be your moderator today. We have here with me a very exciting agenda ahead of us today and some very knowledgeable colleagues from my team who are present to speak to you on the topic of the lab. But before we get into that, I just want to go over some simple housekeeping rules. First, the webinar will be broken into 3 broad parts. In the first 10 minutes or so, we'll give you an overview of the lab and its objectives. In the next 15 minutes, we'll walk you through a couple of example projects to showcase how the lab approaches an opportunity for collaboration. And finally, in the last 10 minutes, we'll leave aside time for any Q&A. I'll be keeping time throughout to make sure we are on track. Second, please feel free to submit a question in the chat window on the right side of your screen at any time. We will collect them and answer them collectively during the Q&A at the end of the webinar. Please always tell us which organization you are from when asking a question, as this will help us to stay in touch with you post the webinar. With that, and without any further ado, let me introduce you to 2 speakers for the webinar today, Badjan Pos and Anant Notial.
Thank you very much, Munir, and a welcome to all our attendees once again. My name is Badjan Pos, and I'm the Director for Inclusive FinTech in the mobile money team at the GSMA, and overall also responsible for the Inclusive Tech Lab.
And thanks from me too, Munir. My name is Anant Notial, and I am a Senior Manager Inclusive FinTech in the mobile money team. My specific role in the lab is to act as an interface between the business and strategic side of the industry and the technical staff in the lab, and help to shape projects that the lab can then execute. We will, of course, cover that in today's webinar.
Thank you very much, Badjan and Anant. Shall we then dive straight into the webinar with an overview of the lab by you, Badjan?
Indeed, Munir, I'll be happy to do so in the next 10 minutes or so. So the story of the lab really starts with the observation that technological innovations are happening faster and faster. And this holds also for developing markets and also for the domain of financial and digital services for the poor. So we see increased internet access and smartphone adoption. We see an arrival of new tech players in the industry. And we also see consumers changing expectations around digital access to financial and other services. And these changes are of such extent that the mobile money industry and overall the digital industry that we see today in emerging markets may no longer be recognizable 5 years from now. Now, at the GSMA, we actually see that as a tremendous opportunity. And we also believe that the mobile industry is uniquely positioned to drive these technologies that will shape the future of financial and digital inclusion. So many companies are, of course, navigating these technological trends in the market. And there's also a whole series of accelerator programs that support companies in their ramp up towards innovation. And yet we believe that there is a sweet spot that this lab that we just recently founded sits in. And that really has to do with this lab founded by the GSMA being a collaborative space for the industry to try out new things in a hand-on fashion. So the mission of the lab really is to support our industry with inclusive innovations with the aim to increase financial and digital inclusion of the underserved. So together with industry participants, we are building a dedicated team of technopreneurs. And this team, together with those stakeholders, will take on a hands-on approach to research, test, and particularly develop novel inclusive technologies for the future. So jointly with industry stakeholders, the lab will strategize, build, and pilot solutions, and then disseminate the insights and assets to the wider industry to use. So conceptually, what would the flow look like? So in front of you, you see this slide, and basically it's for us to stay in tune with the trends in the industry, also based on the input that I hope people like in the audience today will provide us with. So based on those trends, we would ideate. So basically look at what type of trends are around in the market, and those that we feel are most promising, we would explore and turn into feasible research projects and disseminate those results and provide thought leadership to the industry. But let's say there's a number of them what we really feel are promising. So for those, we would like to set up industry collaborations and really develop tangible and readily usable products. So basically come together, develop those innovations and build them up to proof of concept or prototype level or even beyond. And at the end of such projects, collaborations, we would disseminate the results, the insights and the assets to the wider industry. So that's kind of the process. But what type of topical areas are we actually looking at? Well, in front of you, you see some examples, but I'd like to start with the bottom right, the ... because this lab is a space for collaboration. So we're mostly keen on hearing your inputs and your applications to what type of projects you would like to develop together with us. But that said, we'll come to how that process would look like. Yet we've also already identified a number of key areas that we believe are critical for the future of financial and digital services in emerging markets. So the first would be around interoperability. So really this is about how do different financial services become interoperable and communicate with one another. The second one we've dubbed seamless service integration. Well, really this means how do I as a third-party service provider connect to financial services and offer my product to users that can then pay for it over mobile money or financial services. A third topic that we identified has to do with usability. So it's both in this transition from a USSD-based product into an internet-based era, but also particular usability tweaks that can be done to serve particular vulnerable user groups, like disabled people. A fourth topic that we identified is around merchant payments. So how do we pull existing mobile money products further and turn them from a carrier of money into something that can also be used to transact with, basically taking it into shops, into retail settings, you can pay for your products. And the last topic to mention, I would say, has to do with digital identity and electronic know your customer verification. We know that this is often an obstacle for people to be included in financial or digital services. So how can we provide people with a digital identity? So that's some of the topics we have in mind as the lab and that we're currently already composing projects around, and we're really keen on hearing your applications. So if you would apply and come up with a proposal to us, we would of course take that into consideration and we would measure the attractiveness of the proposal based on a number of criteria. And those criteria can basically be split into three categories: foundational, impactful, and operational. So operational really is, can we do it, right? Is the project outcome clearly defined? Is there a clear dissemination strategy and handover plan once the project is completed? Is it viable against resources? Those type of criteria, can we do it? Impactful is really, does it matter? So does it address an actual industry demand? Is there a proper optimization of the efforts that we put into it versus the impact in developmental terms as an output? And foundational really is, thus that project contribute to the mission of the lab that I explained earlier. So that's kind of an overview of the lab in terms of the flow, in terms of the mindset behind it. So let's say we do embark on a specific project. I'd like to hand over to Anand, who can then say how we would like to split this project in tangible steps.
Thank you, Bartjan. Of course, you outlined the main qualities, if you like, of projects that we look at when they approach the lab. But once a project is taken on by the lab, we also look at it from many different angles, and that's what we've tried to capture in the slide here. Broadly, we look at three buckets: business, product, and technical. Starting with the one in the middle, on product, we really look at what is the problem, the business proposition, what is the outcome, the product proposition, functional requirements, wireframes that the product would have that we are trying to achieve through this project. On the business, very briefly, we look at whether whatever we are trying to achieve will be commercially sustainable, and on technical, we look at how it will be put together through things like architecture, code, etc. But we'll go into a lot of detail on these topics in the webinar today. What you've got on the slide now are some of the elements that we will be going into much more detail today, and with the help of business case, product proposition, business proposition, code, architecture, which you see highlighted on your screen, we will use a couple of hypothetical project examples to show you how the lab approaches an opportunity, a project, and looks at it from multiple angles to assess its viability.
Thanks, Bartjan and Anand. That was very helpful overview of the lab. But now I'm starting to see that we are going into the details of how the lab treats individual projects. Right, Anand?
That's absolutely right, Munir. And we'll do that as a dialogue between Bartjan and myself. So, Bartjan, now that we have outlined the key steps involved in scoping a project for the lab, let's deep dive into a few of the crucial ones, starting with the business proposition. What exactly does business proposition mean?
Thanks, Anand. So by business proposition, we mean to address the question, what is the actual problem that we're trying to solve?
So let's take an example. Let's assume that we are trying to build an electric car in the lab. Not that we are going to try and attempt to do that, but just as an example, what would be the business proposition that would lead to such a product?
All right. Electric car, actually, quite like your example. So let's take that as a hypothetical example. I would say that the starting business proposition would have to be, we want to build a product that solves the problem of mobility in primarily urban areas while reducing reliance on fossil fuels.
Okay, so in other words, by business proposition, we want applicants to the lab to think really clearly about the specific challenge they want to address through the project they want the lab to work on with them.
That is correct. For a project to be successful, it really must be based on the real and specific problem that it is trying to resolve. That has to be the starting point.
And I guess that is no different from what we often hear from successful management mantras, that you've got to begin with the end in mind. What is it that you're trying to solve? What is the problem that you're really trying to address when you take on a project? Because if you're not clear about a specific challenge that you're trying to overcome, it's unlikely that you will actually have a good project. Thanks, Bartjan. That's very clear. But then what is business product proposition, rather? Is that different from business proposition?
Yeah, so the product proposition starts the process of fleshing out the kind of product that can address the problem outlined by that business proposition.
I see. So in the case of our hypothetical business proposition, which was to resolve the problem of mobility in urban settings, etc., what could a product proposition be?
So I think the product proposition could be something like, we need to build a 600 horsepower electric car that can easily accommodate a typical urban family of four. So essentially, we encourage the applicant to move from business to product proposition. What we really want them to do is to start thinking about the minimum viable product, or MVP, that they would like to be delivered at the end of the product. So what does the MVP do? What are the functional requirements? What are the screen flows and the wireframes, etc.? The MVP must be defined by the applicant before the project is taken up by the lab.
I see. So the product proposition essentially starts the process of specifying what kind of product or offering could address the problem outlined in the business proposition, taking it to the stage of defining the MVP.
Correct, Anand. It is the natural flow from a problem statement to a proposed solution.
Okay, so we understand what we mean by business proposition, product proposition, but then we have something called business case as well. What is that?
Yeah, well, so the business case is distinct from business proposition. let's try to keep this easy. While business proposition is centered on the problem the project is trying to solve, and product proposition identifies what the product could be to solve that problem, the actual business case assesses whether producing this project is actually aligned with the interests of the industry.
Right. So again, sticking with our earlier hypothetical example of the electric car, business case would assess whether or not a car maker, let's say like Tesla, stands to gain commercially or strategically by producing an electric car.
That is right. It is important to point out that even if there is a clear need to be addressed and a precise product that can address that need, it is not always the case that business can rush in to solve that problem. It must make commercial and strategic sense for the industry to get involved in producing a product or service to address a need. And really, for the lab to take on a project, it is essential that it is aligned with the interests of the industry.
How would an applicant to the lab be expected to assess the business case of their proposed project?
Well, I would say in pretty much the same way that any business assesses an opportunity. So by getting a sense of the size of the market and the number of people reached, the revenue potential and commercial sustainability, etc., etc. Also, we expect applicants to dedicate their own resources to a project, which also serves to underline its business case and the relevance for them.
Right, so we understand business proposition, product proposition, and business case, but now what is architecture?
Yeah, we would be tempted to forget that this lab is actually a technical facility at the end of the day, right? So we are technopreneurs that build things. So for this, the lab staff need clear instructions in the shape of wireframes, technical requirements, and yes, a technical architecture as well.
I understand. So the architecture depicts how the product or service will be put together. Again, using the hypothetical example we have been working with, the architecture step would outline how the electric car would look and how its different components would fit together.
Correct. Drawing out the technical architecture of a product or service before we start building it is essential for success, right?
Right, of course. And then, finally, what is code?
Well, code is really the actual stuff that the product will be made of, right?
So in the electric car example, this is like the actual instructions for the robots in the factory to start building the car.
That's right. It's the actual zeros and ones, or in the case of the car, the nuts and the bolts that will make the product or service run.
Thanks, Bart-Jan. I think that is very clear to me, and through the 5 steps we have identified, it was hopefully very clear to our audience today the different aspects of every opportunity we assess when taking on a project for the lab.
Bart-Jan and Anand, that was so clear. Thank you for breaking it down for us. But, wait a second, guys. Although we use the example of an electric car to describe the process steps of the lab, you break down the business proposition, product proposition, business case, architecture, and code. Can we now map them to the kind of project that the lab is likely to take on? Perhaps in one of the priority areas that we outlined at the start of the webinar. Maybe gender, merchant payments, or identity, perhaps?
Yeah, sure, Munir. Actually, I really like that. So let's scope out these steps for a hypothetical project in one of the hottest areas where we see activity right now. Digital identity and electronic know your customer verification. That's really a hot topic of debate these days. So let's try that out.
Fantastic. Thanks, Bart-Jan. So let us imagine a scenario where someone approaches us with a project idea that entails using a digital identity to bring a group of underserved customers into the fold of digital services and providing them with a specific digital product. How would the various steps we have outlined work in the case of such a project idea?
Well, I actually quite like the way you describe this stage now, Anand, because the level of detail that you present is pretty much the level of detail of many of the early applications that we've received. But before we can really embark on this, Anand, I think we have to take a couple of steps. Can you be a bit more specific about the project? So, for instance, which underserved segment are you talking about? What kind of digital identity will they be issued? And what digital service are you planning to provide them, aided by that identity? Because the lab really does need specific ideas to work.
All right, I understand, Bart-Jan. Okay, so let's say the target segment is that of underserved informal sector workers, especially women. The project seeks to build an online platform that records the details of such workers in a particular market and creates a digital identity for them. And on the back of that database and digital identity, let us say that the project seeks to offer tailored credit products to the informal sector workers based on the number of jobs they have executed through the platform or their length of service, etc. If someone came to us with a project idea like this, how would they go through the various steps we have outlined?
All right, so let's start with the business proposition like before. What is the problem that this project is looking to resolve? Perhaps the problem is that informal sector workers don't have a way to organize themselves and find suitable jobs. And because they work in the informal sector, they have no formal digital identity and are consequently not eligible for products and services.
Yes, I think that sounds about right. That could be the business proposition. And what would be the product proposition here?
So the product proposition could be an online platform that stores the details of all those informal sector workers in the target country and also assigns them with an augmented digital identity that they can use then across a number of different products and services like credit. So really, it's important to point out that what we look for is for applicants to have already developed a fairly clear idea of what the minimum viable product or that MVP from the project is expected to be at the end of engagement with the lab.
Right, I understand. And what about the business case, architecture, and coding elements? What would they entail for this opportunity?
So I think there is a couple of components there. For the business case, we would first look for evidence that creating this online database of informal sector workers would actually offer a sustainable business opportunity to the companies that create the platform. So how are they planning to monetize the platform? Through a membership fee for informal sector workers, or a fee paid by customers that use the platform, or adjacencies like advertisements, or all of the above. We would look for detailed plans on this front to ensure commercial sustainability of developmental projects. The second, remember that the lab is part of the M4D team at the GSMA, so the Mobile for Development Foundation. That means that the strength of the business case is also derived from the value of this project in terms of developmental impact, specifically the number of beneficiaries reached. And third, as part of the lab's core objectives, the results from any project will also be disseminated and shared with the wider industry. So we measure the potential of a project in terms of its value it brings in other countries, verticals, etc. as well. So these three factors, the commercial sustainability, the developmental impact, and the power to disseminate the results to the wider industry are really three factors that contribute towards the business case of a project.
Right, I see, Bart-Jan. And for architecture, you would look for the details of what the MVP of this platform and credit service would look like. Could you elaborate on that a bit?
Sure, Anand. For architecture, we would really flesh out the proposed products that the project aims to deliver. So to start with, we must have a deep dive on the MVP in terms of its product features, technical requirements, and system architecture. So let's take that step by step. On product features, for instance, we have to ask ourselves questions like, is it a website or an app? Can it be accessed on feature phones, or does it require smartphones and a strong data connection? How exactly do service providers register on it? And how do customers access it, and how do they search for particular suppliers? And what about this credit element that you mentioned? Is the credit offered automatically to service providers who are eligible for it, or do they need to apply for it? All these and more are the questions that must be answered at the stage of defining the product features of the MVP. So now, having clarity on the product features of that MVP, we must then focus on the technical requirements. These will require us to think about what's happening under the hood, if you wish, in terms of the product features described earlier. So for instance, if you know that sign-up flow, how do you technically preserve the security of that sign-up in terms of password, two-factor authentication, secure storage of private ID credentials, and so on? And let's also think a little bit about the wireframes, which are a description of the steps and screen flows through this website or app for the possible use cases supported. So for instance, when applying for credit, what is the order of screens that I will encounter on the website or on that app? And finally, coming to the system architecture, as we spoke about a website or app, there will surely be some servers where the details of the users are securely stored. So how are those servers connected? What protocols do they use? And so on. Those kind of questions would have to be answered on the system architecture.
Wow. That is a lot of information, Bart-Jan. But dare I ask, there's one more thing left. What is code?
So yeah, code is basically what the technical team really builds to execute the project. It is the software that makes the MVP.
Right. I think that really helps to clarify how some of the key steps of our application process work for a potential project. But how exactly can applicants share all this detail about this project with us?
Yeah, that's a good question. As we're kind of wrapping up this example, right? I imagine that some people in the audience are actually interested to know how to work with the lab. So that is really where our simple project proposal template comes in. We know that to build the kind of innovative projects that we have in mind, there will need to be a lot of back and forth between the lab staff and the teams bringing the projects to us. But the project proposal template that we crafted and share with the industry provides an excellent place to start putting down the specifics of the project for the lab's consideration.
What an engaging discussion by Jen and Anand. Thank you very much for sharing with us in detail the various steps involved in the lab working on the project. I guess now we can have about 10 minutes for Q&A from the attendees of the webinar. So please, if you could kindly send in your questions through the chat box on the right of your screen. Right. We are going to start the Q&A session now. We have some interesting questions and discussions coming in already. I can see in the chat box. So please keep your questions coming. The first question we have is, I have an interesting idea, but need MNOs to adopt it. Can the lab help? Anand?
Thank you, Munir. And that is, of course, a very important question, and we hear it quite a lot. I think the first thing we want to say in response to that question is, look, the GSMA is the Industry Association of Mobile Operators. So we are, of course, inclined towards them. But it's important to point out that the lab is not restricted to working with mobile operators alone. If you have a terrific idea, we would be delighted to hear from you, even if you're not a mobile operator. Now, regarding the question of introducing specific entities to mobile operators, as a foundation and industry association, we are not in a position to provide preferential treatment or introductions for particular industry players. Our proposal, in line with the mission of the lab, aims to support the wider industry, and anything that the lab does should be open to participation by all players.
Indeed, indeed. Another question here is, does the lab provide funding? And I've seen quite a lot of you asking this question. So, but Jen, does the lab provide funding?
Yeah, indeed, this is a question we receive more frequently, of course. So a very short answer would be no, the lab does not provide funding. There's a whole series of incubators and accelerator programs out there that provide that type of financial support. However, that would be an overly short answer as well at the same time, because the aim of the lab really is to fill that sweet spot of industry collaboration and providing a playground for parties to come together and actually build technologies. So while we don't provide actual funding to projects, we do, of course, provide our expertise, our resources, our personnel, and additional expertise that we can get on board. So in that way, we do actively make that investment in projects. And we're also counting on the counterparts, the participants in the projects, to make their commitments. And last, also, if a project is really successful, we would even invest our efforts to help you hit the road with it.
Another question here I have is that who owns the IP of the output? Is dissemination only to GSMA members? And also, what is the commercial model if the product is taken to market?
Right. Let me take that question, Munir. I think there are three parts to it. So let me talk about the IP element first. And maybe a lot of people are worried here that will the GSMA own the IP of an interesting idea that they bring to the lab? Let's put them at rest by first saying that the lab does not intend to own the IP of the projects or the ideas that you bring to it. We are not. That is our null hypothesis or our base position. That is not something that we're interested in. We would, however, like the participants involved in doing the project with the lab to have a very clear idea of who owns the IP of the product that will be produced at the end of their engagement with the lab. If it's one partner only, we would like them to have a very clear plan on that. If it's more than one participant involved, we want them to have a clear plan on sharing the IP. And that is indeed part of what we mean by the criterion at the start of the project proposal template when we say you need to have a clear exit strategy for this project. So as part of that, you need to have a very clear plan on who owns the IP. We don't have plans to own the IP for anything that you do with us. I think you had some other questions related to the dissemination elements. I'll give a very quick answer to that, Munir. We are not aiming to keep either working with or disseminating the results of this lab with just MNOs. Everything that we do is open source, is open for participation. So anything that comes out of the lab will be open to all players. I think there was a third question, but I forget which one you. The commercial.
The commercial model.
What is the commercial model? Again, I would link that to a clear exit strategy. If you're bringing a product to the lab, you need to have a very clear picture of who owns the IP and also how this is going to be commercially viable going forward. So the ball is in your court, but we will definitely look at that as part of a clear exit strategy.
Indeed. Another question here that I have, Bajan, if you've talked in detail about the technical aspects of the lab, the question here is, what are the technical credentials of the lab? So if you could elaborate on that.
Yeah, that's a very valid question, of course, as this is a new endeavor that the GSMA is setting up. So there's a couple of components to that question, I would say. So the first component is, as an industry association, we have connections with the wider industry globally. So that's the first benefit of working in this playground together, that we would leverage our network in the industry based on our years of experience and our unique position in the industry. Secondly, we have an agile squad of technical experts with different expertise in the areas that we discussed earlier in the session. Within the domain of mobile and financial services. So we have that expertise on board, but third, should there be a gap, as we're very open to all sorts of project applications, we have the means to acquire additional expertise or resources, if so required. And maybe that links also to a question that I saw earlier coming by in the chat box. The question whether we actually build the projects or just provide technical assistance. Yeah. So what we aim to do is to really bring together a group of stakeholders, including ourselves and participants in the project, and develop that project together. So that means development efforts come from our side, yes, and we're requesting also active building capacity from the participants. But it's more than technical assistance what we provide. We can actually build the products.
Yeah, so technical assistance, building the product, you have technical experts and also access to the wider industry network. So that's what members are having. Great. I have another short and precise question that I will need an answer or yes or no is, can universities be a partner?
Yes, definitely. And also, can non-fintech parties, also saw that question coming by, be involved, like governments or other sorts of parties? Yes, for sure. We're looking for innovations within the mobile domain that drive financial and the wider part of digital inclusion. So if there's contributions to be made by universities or governments or other organizations, we'd be very keen to work together.
Yeah. And also to tie into that, another question that's asking whether the products need to be tied to telcos. I believe in the presentation, Anand, you actually mentioned that, but to be clear, if you could just...
Yes, just to reiterate, I think if there are two words that you take away from this webinar today, they should be open participation. We are not restricted to working with just mobile operators. So I think anybody who has that concern should put them at ease.
Right. Very well. A lot of you have asked also if the slides and or webinar will be shared. Yes, we'll have the webinar available at the GSMA website as well as YouTube, so you can go in there at any time and have a listen. But also, if you have any more questions, you can write to us at any time at inclusivetechlab@gsma.com. That is inclusivetechlab@gsma.com. Well, that's all we have time for today, folks. So thank you very much for tuning in, and goodbye.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.